makes it an iconic Japanese landmark. But its near-perfect symmetry belies its destructive nature. Mount Fuji is a stratovolcano. Its last major eruption was 300 years ago, but it is still active and one day will erupt again. It's a very appropriate symbol for this island nation. Japan is prone to violent earthquakes, and it has more than 100 active volcanoes. The country is spread over 3 major islands. Kyushu in the south is currently the most active. It has several massive volcanoes, including 2 that are considered to be among the world's top 5 most dangerous, Aso and Sakurajima. Both are serious threats to the island's population of 13 million. This is Sakurajima. It's located on the southern tip of Kyushu. Scientists pay close attention to this volcano, and for good reason. Sakurajima has produced a number of cataclysmic eruptions in the past few centuries. The last was in 1914. What's especially concerning is that it sits across a narrow strait from the city of Kagoshima and its 600,000 inhabitants. A major eruption would put the city and its people in serious danger. Volcanologist and photographer Dr. Tom Pfeiffer has come to Sakurajima just as it's entering a new phase of larger eruptions. His timing is excellent. Just as he's driving into Kagoshima, Sakurajima erupts.
Sakurajima, which had some massive eruptions earlier today. The whole northern and western sector is hazy. That's actually the ash plumes. Reports say ash went up to 17,000 feet. That is more than 5 kilometers altitude, and it's a record number, I think, for this year.
Tom pulls over to get a better look at this eruption, which is sending a big ash cloud into the sky.
And it's continuing to spew ash. And you see all this haze, that's all ash, which is still dissipating from the large plumes emitted earlier. Apparently it is right now in a very violent phase of activity. If you look over the past months, it has been building up gradually and continues to build up, apparently. So we don't know what's happening next.
Sakurajima has been in a phase of nearly continuous eruption since 1955. It normally erupts once or twice a day, but in the past few weeks, the frequency of the eruptions has increased exponentially. As many as 10 to 15 times a day, with ash plumes up to 5 times larger than usual. Scientists still can't predict the timing of a major eruption, but they are afraid that this volcano is building up to something major. An eruption similar in magnitude to 1914 could be devastating. It could potentially destroy the city of Kagoshima.
From here you get the sense of how close Kagoshima city is actually to the volcano. Volcanologists know that the volcano has been inflating gradually ever since the 1914 eruption and has reached the same level as it had before the last Plinian eruption.
What that means is that the volcano has replenished itself enough that its magma reservoirs can produce a major eruption, something it has done several times over the past 600 years.
So it is thought that it might be actually due at some point, not necessarily tomorrow or the next month, but in a not too distant future, it could be due for another larger eruption. That would clearly put the city at the risk, particularly of pyroclastic flows. If you have an eruption column that rises, imagine 15, 20 kilometers.
That could be catastrophic for the city. Large eruption plumes can collapse under their own weight, causing a burning hot avalanche of ash and gas called a pyroclastic flow. They are capable of generating tsunamis or even traveling over the water on a superheated layer of steam, burning everything in their path.
Those pyroclastic flows could sweep and engulf the whole city. To evacuate a large city like Hiroshima is not an easy task, clearly. If you look at the lower slopes, you see this dust floating. This is ash from the recent eruptions that's being blown around the island. And people who live there have that constantly. Anything you wash after a day is coated with ash.
Sakurajima means Cherry Blossom Island. It was given that fanciful name because its explosions cover the volcano in glowing rocks that resemble a tree in blossom. Even though Sakurajima is very active, travel to the island on which it sits is still possible. After Tom takes the ferry over, he'll be able to drive to the active Showa crater, which is on the far side. But there are hazards. Getting there means he'll have to pass right through the ash cloud.
This is clearly where the plume had passed that followed, that was produced by the big explosions earlier today. And in fact, you can see a lot of ash covering the leaves. Look at the car in front of us, and this ash is everywhere. This can be very heavy if you have to live here, and this is something you have every few days. But people go on living here, and they stick to their place. They don't want to give this up.
This tour shop is as close to the volcano as Tom can get and still be safe. The area beyond it is off limits.
What we're seeing is that the eruption is continuing. With every few seconds you see jets of material and lightnings now in the ash plume rising, and they contribute to this sustained plume that reaches 1-2 kilometers above the vent and then spreads, and all that. The northeastern sector is under ashfall. It's quite spectacular, actually.
This is not typical behavior from Sakurajima, and it's likely attributed to a new pulse of magma coming up from depth that has led to a more sustained ash eruption.
Let's hope the wind stays at this, because we are outside the ash plume and we have a clear view to the crater. This is great. Let's pray it stays like this. On the other side, it's miserable now. You have dust in the air and ash falling, and you have to be inside, lock the windows. If you're outside, you better wear a face mask.
Sakurajima's usual eruptions are a single blast that only lasts a few minutes. This one has gone on for several hours.
The question is, could this be a precursor to a much bigger eruptive phase? I don't dare to say. On the long term, maybe.
Although volcanoes can and do erupt without warning, most large-scale eruptions have a build-up phase as more magma is pushed into the system. As this is happening, there are many localized effects like earthquakes that can be detected by high-tech instruments, or sometimes even felt by the people living around the volcano.
Before the 1918 eruptions, there has been a very marked increase in earthquake activity. Visible deformation of the inflation of the ground, the coastline visibly changed, and things like this are expected to happen as a precursor of another big eruption, which would imply a much greater volume to erupt. And greater, I mean, orders of magnitude greater, 100 times more than what has happened today.
Before the 1914 eruption, the city of Kagoshima was rocked by 3 weeks of very strong volcanic earthquakes that caused a number of fatalities. The quakes are triggered when new magma breaks the ground rock as it pushes up to the surface.
What interests volcanologists to study is actually to have a picture of what is actually happening underneath. And that understanding what is happening underneath might eventually help to have an idea about what is going to happen. Unfortunately, it is not very well understood, and it's extremely difficult to be sure and certain what is happening.
Scientists don't fully understand what triggers big eruptions. The current belief is that once a magma chamber is filled, as Sakurajima's, Any new large injection of fresh hot magma can reinvigorate the older semi-cooled magma in the volcano's reservoir. The heat and pressure of the new material can trigger a large eruption. Eruptions are limited to the amount of eruptible magma within the underground reservoir. A big event can virtually empty that chamber. Right now, scientists believe Sakurajima's chamber has refilled to 90%, which makes a larger 1914 size eruption possible. Or it can erupt moderately like we are seeing here, gradually reducing the pressure within. That scenario could mean that a major eruption is less likely since the volcano can't build up enough pressure. The other concern is that these smaller eruptions can also open the conduit that connects to the magma chamber. If that happens, the result is like popping the cork on a champagne bottle. The eruption can then sustain itself until the magma chamber is virtually empty. That scenario could happen quickly with very little advance warning.
It sounds like a thunderstorm in the distance.
The activity is spectacular, but today at least is not the precursor to a larger eruption. Things wind down as the night goes on, but after dark, Tom can see a glow within the crater. That confirms that the magma is able to push all the way to the opening of the crater vent. By morning, the ash emission has nearly stopped. It's not over. The volcano is recharging before it begins another eruptive phase. The cycle that Sakurajima is going through is considered high, but still in the realm of normal. In Japan, the news of Sakurajima's increasing activity is watched closely by an anxious population. What has touched off public fear is that several volcanoes have become active at the same time, volcanoes that have been quiet for decades or centuries. They're the latest reminders of just how geologically active the country is. In 2011, Japan was rocked by a major earthquake and tsunami and the subsequent meltdown of the Fukushima nuclear plant. More than 19,000 people died, and the entire area was evacuated. The Tohoku quake was a national trauma that has increased awareness and raised alarm about the potential of more natural disasters. And in 2014, 50 people were killed when Mount Ontake erupted suddenly and without warning. The eruption sent a pyroclastic flow down the mountain, killing unsuspecting hikers. On top of that, Hakone, the volcano closest to Tokyo, has been raised to alert level 3 out of 5, after thousands of small earthquakes and a sharp increase in heat was recorded at the summit. There are fears that it too may soon erupt. The Japanese media gives these stories prominent coverage. The population wants to know the government and its civil defense force have plans in place in case of another disaster. While Tom is exploring Sakurajima, a major eruption happens several hours south. Mount Shindake on the island of Kuchino-Arabujima erupts violently, sending a huge ash cloud into the sky and triggering a potentially dangerous pyroclastic flow. The eruption was caught on a government web camera, and it shows the sudden, horrifying nature of the explosion. This powerful eruption could have had dire consequences, but luckily, the island had few inhabitants. There were only 2 injuries. Eruptions of this magnitude are infrequent. So Tom has left Sakurajima and is traveling by ferry to Yakushima, the island directly across from the eruption. If conditions are right, it will give him an excellent place to see the aftermath of the eruption and to see how Japan responds to a volcanic crisis. Japanese media has descended on the local police station that has become the command center for the disaster.
息子がいる大阪に向かうと話し、避難所から出ていく人もいました。
Yesterday, at about this time, a very large explosion occurred on the neighboring island of Kuchino Erabuchima. It was an incredible, large, unexpected explosion that forced the evacuation of the whole island. You see lots of TV crews, they're all covering this story, which is the headline all over Japan. I bet nobody expected it to be that large. It produced an eruption column 9 kilometers high, which spread out, and at the base of the column, part of the ejected material immediately collapsed and caused a violent pyroclastic flow, which fortunately didn't go through exactly the populated area, it seems, but it was very close. It illustrates a bit the problem if you live on an active volcanic island. In case of a large eruption like the one yesterday, there are not many places you can go and hide.
Tom heads to the lighthouse at Nagata Cape. It's the closest point to Kuchino Arabujima Island and is the best vantage point to see the volcano. But bad weather and the heavy concentration of airborne ash from the eruption have reduced visibility considerably. Tom can't see the volcano.
Unfortunately, the island is, of course, and makes sense, off limits, and the weather is not cooperating. You can't even see it. But we gave it a try. In case there would be another eruption, you should be able to see the plume, and maybe in clear weather you can even see the island. It's already quite a bit of luck to be in the vicinity of this event.
The media is questioning if these volcanoes are becoming more active because of the Tohoku quake.
It has always been questioned, and many people tend to think that there must be a correlation between earthquake activity and volcanic activity. And in fact, there is probably some relation, but it's currently not even well understood.
To a volcanologist, this eruption is another chance to study the phenomena up close. But for a nation still shaken by the earthquake and tsunami at Tohoku, this large eruption once again raises collective fears. Japan is a very geologically active country. On a relatively small landmass, it has more than 100 active volcanoes. Japan's abundant earthquakes and volcanoes can be explained by the science of plate tectonics. The Earth's surface is broken up into just over a dozen large sections or plates. They are constantly moving at about the rate a fingernail grows. When two plates collide, the denser of the two is forced under the other and back into the Earth. The place where they meet is called a subduction zone. As the denser plate descends, friction causes stress to build to the breaking point. It slips suddenly, causing an earthquake, and sometimes a tsunami. As the denser subducting plate is forced downwards into the hot mantle, the water and sediments that are pulled down with it begin to boil off. This lowers the melting point, and the rock around begins to melt, creating magma. The more buoyant magma rises towards the surface. Japan is the result of a major subduction zone.
You have to consider that it is only roughly 50 years that the whole concept of plate tectonics has been accepted, and it is still a science in really evolution.
For now, it's a theory that scientists can test against.
Right now, of course, each major earthquake, each volcanic eruption provides a new opportunity. You can test your previous models. You have a fresh case. As science advances and monitoring techniques, instruments become more refined, you have the ability to measure and detect more subtle changes that you were not able to see maybe 5 years ago as technology constantly improved. But it's not very easy to establish a rule to say we have a big earthquake, so for sure we will have volcanic eruptions.
At this point, it is unlikely Mount Shindaki will erupt again. So Tom spends time observing how the emergency response team is handling the situation. Japan has been sharpening its skills when it comes to disaster response. Within hours of the eruption, the island was completely evacuated. By the end of the day, mobile command centers had been set up around the island to relay information back to their operation headquarters. Tom is with a few members of the Kagoshima Civil Protection Communications Division. This is the same team that would be responsible for an eruption of Sakurajima.
This island is approximately 150 kilometers away, and it's in a quite remote area, so they're doing an amazing job. They're showing us the camera that they were having on the helicopter, who arrived on the scene just 40 minutes after the eruption. And then the main team followed right afterwards and is now based here. And yeah, they are here, and it's quite impressive to see this, the level of alertness of the Japanese authorities in response to a volcanic crisis.
The teams are equipped to relay video and data in real time back to the command center in Kagoshima. All of this can be packed and loaded on a helicopter and be on site within an hour. Their vehicles are equipped with generators capable of powering a small village.
This case was a small island with approximately 150 inhabitants. Now, you have to, of course, try to imagine what you would do in the case of an eruption at Sakurajima of that scale, where you have 700,000 people living in the city.
The eruption was powerful. It will likely be rated a VEI 3 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. The Civil Protection Force will remain in place for several weeks in case there is a secondary eruption. The response to this explosion was swift and effective. No lives were lost. It's another chance for this unit to hone its technique. Because in Japan, the question isn't will there be another eruption, but when.
I think if any country is really preparing for worst case scenarios, a large explosion of Sakurajima, Japan is probably the best prepared on a global scale.
Tom heads back to Kagoshima to explore a sleeping giant, so massive that its potential threat is almost impossible to comprehend. This is the explosive center of an ancient volcano, so massive that this entire area, including part of the city of Kagoshima and Sakurajima, are sitting above a giant magma chamber. Deep beneath the waters of Kagoshima Bay is a much bigger menace, the giant Aira caldera.
The entire city literally sits inside the volcano. You see the cliff over there, it goes around from about 24 kilometers by 18 kilometers, a rectangular area that is the caldera. Probably the worst place for it to be.
A caldera is a feature that happens after an eruption empties the magma chamber and the ground above collapses into it. The eruption of Aira caldera took place 22,000 years ago, and in the years since, there hasn't been a bigger eruption on Earth. Its effects can be found all around the bay.
This hill Shiroyama means white mountain, literally. Shiro, white, Yama mountain. White, you can see why. It's full of pumice. The white pieces are pumice and fine ash. It's the same material as pumice and darker fragments. Geologists call this a non-valid ignimbrite. It's the result of a massive, a giant volcanic eruption. This is just a tiny part of the deposit. The whole cliff is probably 100 to 200 meters high, is composed of this material. And in fact, this eruption was so large, it deposited pumice and ash all over Japan.
The eruption was so massive, it was believed to be 200 times the scale of the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in the United States. Mount St. Helens sent a huge ash cloud into the air so big that deposits were found in 11 states and 5 Canadian provinces. It was rated as a VEI 5 eruption and one of the largest in recent times. Eruptions are measured using the VEI, or Volcanic Explosivity Index. They're based on the amount of material ejected and the height of the ash plume. The scale ranges from 1 to 8. VEI 1 is gentle. VEI 8 is mega colossal. Each successive number is 10 times greater in scale than the previous. An eruption is classified from start to stop. The current eruption phase of Sakurajima has lasted more than 70 years for a total combined rating of VEI 3. Compare this to Sakurajima's 1914 eruption, which lasted just 8 months, was rated VEI 4. Aira's caldera eruption ranks as supercolossal, between VEI 7 and VEI 8. An eruption of this magnitude hasn't happened in recorded history. The closest is the 1812 eruption of Tambora in Indonesia, which was a VEI 7. That eruption killed 92,000 people and caused widespread crop failures throughout Europe that lasted several years. The Aira eruption 22,000 years ago was 8 times more massive than that.
This massive, giant eruption, or if you want to call it a supervolcano eruption, a super eruption, had a result that the crust of the Earth sank several hundred meters, forming what is called the Aira caldera, and then a large 24 by 18 kilometer caldera formed. This whole city actually sits inside the Aira volcano. Aira volcano is the whole complex, the whole caldera. We are here on the rim, we are looking down onto the city. This is the crater floor.
A super eruption is fed by the buildup of a lot of magma in the volcano's reservoir. Plate tectonics explains how that works. Instead of 2 plates colliding, where one subducts under the other, around Japan several smaller microplates are being crushed, twisted, and pulled. This movement has made the Earth's crust very thin under the island of Kyushu. To make matters worse, the direction and speed of the subducting plate has created a convection current that is producing an anomaly called a mantle wedge. This brings superheated magma even closer to the surface, where it reacts with groundwater to lower the melting point of the overlying rock layers. It's the volcanic equivalent of the perfect storm. The higher temperatures of the mantle material allows for a lot more magma to be produced at shallower depths. It creates conditions for massive eruptions. This is what's happening under Japan's Kyushu Island, and why the island is littered with active and very dangerous volcanoes, including Aira. Although Sakurajima appears to be a volcano within a volcano, they are one and the same. Sakurajima is a vent of Aira, but has its own magma reservoir. But that reservoir draws its magma from Aira's. That is one of the reasons it can produce large VEI 4 to 5 eruptions every 100 to 200 years.
The whole island of Sakurajima is actually 2 overlapping stratovolcanoes. An older one, Itadake on the left, and the young one, presently active, Minamidake. And all this has grown just within the past 25,000 years. So this is really an incredibly active volcano. It's one out of the 10 most active volcanoes in the Earth, I would say, at the moment. It is definitely Japan's most active one.
Scientists still don't fully understand what triggers a caldera eruption. This is where the massive reservoir erupts. During Sakurajima's 1914 eruption, the entire caldera dropped by almost 2 feet lengths, proving that the 2 magma chambers are connected. But the big and unanswerable question is that enough to destabilize Aira caldera? For the people of Kagoshima, the good news is that super eruptions are infrequent. Such a massive blast requires long periods between eruptions to rebuild the intense volume of molten material within the magma chamber. That process takes many thousands of years. Over the past 300,000 years, there have been several massive caldera eruptions on the island of Kyushu at 20 to 40,000 year intervals. The volcano that is most likely to produce a caldera eruption and in a more advanced stage of recharging is Aso caldera. Aso caldera is not just bigger than Aeras, it's one of the biggest on the planet. It is ranked as one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world.
This caldera belongs to the XL class of calderas. There are not that many in the whole planet that have been active in the past few hundreds of thousands of years. Maybe you can count them in terms of dozens.
Aso sits directly over the apex of the mantle wedge. Here, the crust is also the thinnest in Kyushu, and Aso has produced 4 large caldera eruptions. 3 of them happened within 30,000 years of each other. On a geological timescale, that is very close together. The last one was 90,000 years ago. Aso also contains a geological feature called a resurgent dome. This is where inflation from the magma chamber pushes the caldera floor upwards, indicating a charged magma chamber. It's estimated that the volume of new magma coming into Aso's reservoirs is so great that it is capable of producing a VEI-7 eruption every 10,000 years. It has been recharging for 90,000 years, so it's capable of something massive anytime. But over the past 20,000 years, its activity has been relatively small, and the impact of its eruptions has been localized. There are 5 major peaks and 17 cones. One of them, Mount Nakadake, is still active.
This bluish haze is very typical if there is SO2 gas present. And that is very typical if magma is actually very close to the vent. So I suspect the eruption is still going on. It is just right now maybe a bit quiet, but it could produce explosions anytime. Of course, if a sudden explosion occurs, it's extremely hazardous. And in fact, people in the past, unfortunately, have been killed there by projectiles.
The SO2, or sulfur dioxide gas, is toxic and an obvious danger. In fact, Aso has a history of small but deadly incidents. 2 people were killed in 1979 from a sudden explosion that caught everyone off guard. 11 others were injured when a rock crashed through the roof of a bomb-proof shelter. Tourists had been able to take a cable car to the crater, but that was suspended just over 2 years ago, when the volcano alert level was raised to 3. Tom is going to get a rare view. He has arranged special permission with government officials to visit the active crater. The current eruptive crater of Nakadake has 7 vents that have erupted in historical times. You can tell how active a volcano is by how quickly it builds new mass.
Very large and extremely active volcano. Remember all this mountain with all these cones and so it's just the central part of the much larger complex, and it's only 90,000 years old, which is in geologic terms almost nothing. So for a volcano it's still a very young age. Wow, yeah, it's a very impressive crater. You have no idea when you're down there, it looks so flat and harmless, but this is actually something. Wow, yeah. Wow. Okay, we are there. Yeah, it's impressive. The Nakadake crater is all this actually. It goes on over there. It is more than 1 kilometer long in total. It has 7 different vents, out of which we see 2 here that are active. You hear the roaring, so there is a very intense degassing going on. Magma is very close to the surface. Explosions could actually occur anytime. Number 2 crater is also active. There's a lot of degassing going on. It's not so much steam, but apparently lots of SO2. This bluish haze is created by SO2. We're almost out of the plume, but you still can smell sulfur now. Wind is swirling a bit. We're at the edge of this haze, so I guess, yeah, if we were right in the plume, we'd probably need the gas mask to breathe in.
The gases coming off the plume are deadly. In 1997, 3 people were killed on this spot when they were overcome by the noxious gas.
Nobody can predict whether it will just gradually calm down now in the coming weeks and months, or it might re-intensify. As a couple of months ago, you could almost see constant strombolian activity, at least from the webcam. I wasn't here, of course. So you would have seen incandescent pieces of lava being ejected, and they've piled up to form that cone.
Up until recently, the crater contained a lake, but the water boiled off because of the extreme heat. Water from the surrounding hill drains into the crater, making this volcano unpredictable.
I find this is extremely impressive. The contrast couldn't be... There's an explosion! Explosion! This is a maybe phreatomagmatic explosion. See ash jets.
The eruption is a result of groundwater coming into contact with hot magma. It flashes to steam. As a gas, it expands to more than 1,200 times its volume in a sudden explosion. Much of the plume is water vapor.
You could probably see stones being ejected. This was a very small one, but it's... Well, that was fantastic. Another one, yeah. You see the black fingers of ash followed by white steam. This is very typical for phreatomagmatic explosions. Killed here. If this volcano was not monitored and there was free access, you would have hundreds of people maybe, on a good day, walking around here. And then, of course, the more people there are on the rim, the more likely it is that during an explosion there could be an incident. And during daylight, especially, they're not glowing, you have very little chance to escape them. Even the hard head would not... It gives a protection against small things, but if you have a block like this, the head is useless. Imagine this 100 times bigger and we'd be in trouble. For me, this was absolutely amazing.
Although the eruption was small and not threatening, the situation has now become unpredictable. The officials have asked everyone to leave.
The best way to decrease risk is to limit the time in a hazardous place. So we've seen 2 really nice small explosions, so we don't want to risk to get into a bigger one, which could happen. So that's legitimate. They know the volcano and they don't want to go take us to any higher risk levels. So I completely understand.
Large caldera volcanoes work on a geological clock, taking tens of thousands of years to ready themselves for a major eruption. And in those terms, overdue for a caldera eruption, or it could still be thousands of years off. Given its size and history, Aso is capable of producing a massive eruption. Everything in its danger zone could be wiped out, including Kumamoto City, which is downslope from the volcano. In recent history, the only eruption we can relate it to is the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. It was the largest eruption to affect a populated area in the 20th century, with a ranking of VEI 6. It caused incredible devastation to the surrounding area. The ashfall was recorded in places as far away as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia. That eruption was an important landmark. It was the first time that scientists were able to predict the eruption in time to do mass evacuations. Because of that, the death toll was under 1,000. But if history repeats itself, Aso would be on a vastly larger scale. What they'd be looking at would be 40 to 50 times bigger than Pinatubo. This type of eruption can't be planned for or mitigated. The ashfall alone would be so huge that it would affect all of Japan. Its impact would be global, but hopefully it isn't something humans have to deal with for thousands of years. Sakurajima, that volcano's explosive activity has continued to ramp up.
5 to 10 years ago, it was maybe an average of 1 eruption, 2, maybe on a good day, there were 2 per day. There has been a clear increase over the past years though, so it is not unusual now to have maybe up to 10 during phases of elevated activity.
It's likely that Sakurajima is building to a larger eruption, and that could mean something in the range of a VEI4 or VEI5 eruption in the not-too-distant future.
This year alone has produced more explosions than last year combined, and we are only in May. Nobody can predict what the volcano is going to do, but be maybe a long-term precursor to a major phase of activity again.
Japan just in time, catch Sakurajima at its most spectacular period of activity in years.
Sakurajima has put on a great show for us. We've seen tremendous explosions, small and large. We have this beautiful mood over the bay with shipping, with the fishing boats. I've never seen Sakurajima so active before.
Japan has no choice but to grapple with giants. From the seafloor to its tallest peaks, the country is at the mercy of the most elemental geological forces. These forces have created an environment of staggering beauty, but they've also caused devastating disasters. Science is still on a steep learning curve when it comes to volcanoes. But with each new eruption, they are beginning to understand the incredibly complex forces that are at work beneath our Earth's surface. Knowledge that is teaching them how to predict large eruptions before they happen. In a country riddled with active volcanoes, some of which erupt on a daily basis, life goes on for Japan's nearly 130 million people. What else can be done in the face of such powerful forces, except watch and wait, and hope that we learn what we need to before our geological time runs out?